March 1st, 1953. Joseph Stalin is on the floor, barely breathing. The men who could save him are just meters away, but they don't move. They're not waiting for a doctor. They're waiting for him to die. And here's the twist. Stalin wasn't killed by an enemy. He was killed by the fear he created. This is how the most feared man in the Soviet Union was left to die in silence. Stalin's dacha on the outskirts of Moscow was more than a residence. It was a psychological fortress. Built with layers of walls, guards, and strict protocols, it mirrored exactly how he saw the world. A place where loyalty had to be monitored and proximity tightly controlled. Stalin believed that even the closest ally carried, at some point, the seed of betrayal. This worldview shaped every detail of his domestic and political life. He envisioned the geopolitical stage as a chessboard of permanent threats, where moves were calculated not only to win, but to prevent any peace from getting too close to the king. This logic was not confined to diplomacy or war, it seeped into the way he dined. Guests were chosen not only for political influence, but for the utility of keeping them under direct observation. On the night of February 28, 1953, 4 men sat at his table, representing the very core of Soviet power. Lavrenti Beria, the chief of the secret police; Georgy Malenkov, the meticulous administrator; Nikita Khrushchev, the versatile and opportunistic politician; and Nikolai Bulganin, the loyal bureaucrat. Each carried on their hands decisions that had cost thousands of lives, and each knew that a misinterpreted glance could be their last. The tension was not only in their restrained gestures, but in the way they responded to Stalin's remarks. He, in turn, tested boundaries. An ironic comment, a compliment that sounded like a veiled threat, a question that forced the other to answer with surgical caution. In Stalin's mind, this was the real loyalty test, not on battlefields, but at the dinner table, between a plate of food and a glass of wine. Ironically, while the room radiated formality and fear, he likely took some satisfaction in this absolute control, as if each moment was proof that his system worked. But there was one detail no one in that room could foresee: that very web of fear, so effective in keeping everyone in line, was about to turn fatally against him. We are very close to reaching our next subscriber milestone, and when we do, we'll release a special video uncovering a little-known historical episode that changed the course of an entire nation. If you want to see this exclusive content and help make it happen, subscribe now and be part of this achievement. The night of February 28, 1953, seemed to follow the same ritual as so many before. At 74 years old, Stalin still kept the habit of extending dinners late into the night, surrounded by men who knew his temperament and his unspoken rules. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin took their seats at the table, each representing a vital piece of the Soviet power apparatus. The cordiality was superficial. Beneath it pulsed a tension only those who had survived Stalin's inner circle could understand. The dictator alternated calculated moments of humor with silences that forced everyone to measure their words. He recalled military victories, praised his personal role in industrialization and the nuclear program, and made pointed remarks about past mistakes by subordinates. These conversations were more than memories. They were demonstrations of psychological dominance. By reinforcing his achievements, Stalin reminded everyone they were in the presence of the man who had defeated Hitler and shaped the destiny of the USSR. For Stalin, that table was a symbolic battlefield. Toasts with Georgian wine and screenings of patriotic films were not gestures of camaraderie, but part of a carefully staged political theater. Control was in the lingering gaze, in the question that forced the other to expose themselves, in the comment that sounded like praise but carried an embedded test. Paranoia was his lens for interpreting the world. And there, surrounded by his own architects of fear, he felt in command. As the night drew to a close, Stalin still showed energy, bidding farewell to his guests with his usual formality. No one imagined it would be the last time they saw him conscious, but a silent detail was already present. Everyone, without exception, knew that political survival depended on correctly reading the leader's moods. And that night, this very instinct for self-preservation would, within hours, become the fatal barrier between Stalin and any real chance of rescue. The morning of March 1, 1953, began like so many others at Stalin's dacha. Protocol demanded absolute silence until the leader gave signs he was awake. Guards, servants, and cooks moved like shadows, aware that a noise at the wrong moment could cost a career or even a life. The routine was so rigid that any variation became unsettling. As the hours passed, the absence of any sound from Stalin's quarters shifted from routine to a silent warning. Mikhail Butusov, his personal valet, noticed something was wrong. Stalin never remained so long without the sound of footsteps, running water, or orders. But approaching the door meant risking everything. Over the years, he had seen other staff disappear over gestures Stalin interpreted as intrusions. The dacha was not merely a residence, but the physical reflection of a system of fear and isolation. The rules prevented any approach without explicit permission. Fear was not only in the minds of subordinates, it was institutionalized, codified into security procedures. Butusov's hesitation was not a sign of personal weakness, but a survival mechanism shaped by decades of repression. The day moved on, and the silence became unbearable. Other staff members began exchanging discreet glances and whispering nervously. The cook, who had served Stalin for more than 15 years, found it strange not to receive instructions for dinner. In the air, there was a tension so thick it seemed everyone shared the same unspoken question: what if something serious had happened? When Butusov finally decided to enter, about 18 hours had passed since Stalin was last seen. What he found inside the study would alter the course of Soviet history. As he would later describe, he did not find the supreme leader of the country. He found an old man, collapsed on the floor, clothes soiled, breathing weakly. The dictator who had ruled life and death for millions could no longer call for help. The machine of fear he had built had left its creator defenseless. When Butusov opened the study door, the scene he found shattered any image of Stalin's invincibility. The dictator's body lay on its side, face toward the floor, breathing unevenly, clothes soiled. Near the desk, a broken glass and scattered papers suggested the collapse had been sudden. The man who had decided the fate of empires could no longer move an arm to call for help. The immediate reaction was not to summon a doctor. The protocol, steeped in fear, dictated that the head of security be informed first. Colonel Ivan Krustalev arrived quickly, but, like the valet, froze. He knew the consequences of acting without authorization. In Stalin's logic, unsolicited initiative was a form of disobedience, and that logic had shaped the mindset of everyone around him. The dilemma was cruel. If the leader survived and interpreted the action as a violation, he could order imprisonment or execution. If he died for lack of assistance, blame could also fall on those who knew and did nothing. This paralysis was not only psychological, but a direct product of the Soviet political culture under Stalin, a system in which every personal decision carried a calculated survival risk. Lavrenti Beria and Georgy Malenkov were then alerted. Upon arrival, they showed no medical urgency. They assessed the situation with cold calculation, more concerned with political implications than the dictator's physical state. Beria, ever the strategist, asked the central question: Who else knew? Controlling information was the absolute priority. At that moment, Stalin's health was a secondary issue compared to the opportunity and the danger his possible death represented. By then, the clock was working against the patient, but for the men in the room, each minute of delay served to reposition pieces on the power board. The generalissimo was still breathing, but the succession game had already begun. The decision not to call a doctor immediately was not born of casual negligence, but of cold political calculation. Beria and Malenkov knew that each hour of delay reduced Stalin's chances of recovery, but increased the time available to reorganize alliances and measure strength within the Central Committee. In the environment the dictator had created, acting quickly could be interpreted as panic or worse, as an attempt to seize control prematurely. Fear was not confined to lower-ranking subordinates. Even Stalin's closest men lived under the constant shadow of arbitrary accusations. The doctor's plot, launched months earlier, had shown that even highly respected professionals could be accused of conspiracy and executed. Calling a doctor was not just bringing help. It also introduced a new risk variable. What would Stalin think if he awoke to see a physician he had not authorized? While the dictator lay on the floor, breathing heavily, Beria ensured the information never left the dacha. Gates were locked, phone calls monitored, and any contact with the outside world required his direct approval. Khrushchev and Bulganin were summoned, but given only vague orders to appear. Upon arrival, they immediately understood they were facing a moment that could redefine the fate of the Soviet Union. The waiting game was not only about Stalin, it was about who would emerge as the dominant figure in his absence. Every glance, every spoken or unspoken phrase carried strategic weight. As the leader's body weakened, the core of Soviet power was quietly reorganizing itself. By the time they finally decided to call for help, nearly a full day had passed since Stalin collapsed in his office. Choosing which doctors to bring was no simple matter. Many of the best professionals had been imprisoned or executed months earlier, victims of the doctor's plot. Those who remained lived in constant fear, aware that any unfavorable diagnosis could be interpreted as sabotage. The chief physician summoned, Professor Lukomsky, arrived with a small and cautious team. Upon entering the room, he found a degrading scene. The leader of the Soviet Union, motionless, showing clear signs of a cerebral hemorrhage, still lying on the floor where he had fallen. The team began basic procedures, but the political tension in the room made every decision a minefield. Administering a drug or recommending surgery could be viewed as an assassination attempt if the patient did not survive. The doctors knew they were not just treating a man, they were dealing with a political icon whose image was guarded with absolute rigidity. Around them, members of Stalin's inner circle observed every move, mentally recording who said what, who appeared confident, and who hesitated. Medicine in this setting was no longer pure science, but an act of survival. As Stalin received limited care, the clock kept ticking. The nearly 24-hour delay had irreversibly damaged his chances of recovery. That moment revealed more than the dictator's physical state. It exposed the moral and operational collapse of the very system he had built. In the hours that followed, Stalin's breathing grew more erratic. His skin took on an almost translucent pallor, and the once rigid, imposing body seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. The paralysis was not just physical. In that room, everyone, doctors, guards, and political leaders, appeared trapped in an invisible web of fear, calculation, and silence. The doctors limited themselves to basic interventions, controlling his temperature, adjusting his body position, slowly hydrating him. None dared to attempt more invasive procedures. The fear of being accused of murdering the leader hovered over every move. Beria moved through the room like a silent inspector, assessing not only the patient's condition, but also the behavior of every person present. Meanwhile, Malenkov and Khrushchev exchanged brief glances and short phrases. Their apparent concern for the dictator's health masked internal conversations about who would take control and how the news would be delivered to the nation. No one there expected a recovery. The real question was the precise moment Stalin would stop breathing, and what that would mean for the Soviet hierarchy. The atmosphere in the room was thick. The most prominent sound was that of the clock, marking each second that brought everyone closer to the inevitable. There were no tears, no explicit despair. What unfolded was a silent choreography of men accustomed to waiting for the death of others, this time of the man who had shaped each of their lives. At 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin exhaled his final breath. There was no immediate announcement, no dramatic gestures, only the barely perceptible sound of a breath ending. The doctors, tense, mechanically noted the time, aware that every detail of this moment would enter the official record, and possibly be subject to future scrutiny. Those present remained still. The absence of visible emotion did not mean indifference, but decades of conditioning. In that room, any exaggerated reaction could be interpreted as a sign of weakness, opportunism, or even betrayal. Beria broke the silence first, taking it upon himself to organize the room and control the flow of information. His posture was calculated: protect himself, project authority, and shape the narrative before the news spread. For those in the room, Stalin's death did not just mark the end of a man. It signaled the collapse of a system centered entirely around him. Yet, no one knew exactly what would follow. The atmosphere was one of extreme caution, as if every second after that moment was uncharted territory, filled with political traps and personal risks. The morning after Stalin's death was cold and eerily quiet, but the calm was only an illusion. Moscow had yet to learn that the man who had shaped the lives of millions was gone. Inside the inner circle, however, the struggle had already begun. The absence of a clear successor turned the political vacuum into a minefield, where every gesture was measured and every word calculated. Beria moved quickly. His priority was not only to take control, but also to rewrite the narrative of the final days, downplaying the delay in medical care and erasing any hint of negligence. Khrushchev, on the other hand, kept strategically low profile. He observed, gathered information, and waited for the right moment to act. The atmosphere was one of extreme formality, but heavy with distrust. Meanwhile, orders for the official announcement were being drafted with surgical precision. The message had to convey national mourning, exalt the leader's image, and avoid any sign of internal weakness. In practice, the country was entering a transitional period that blended reverence, fear, and uncertain expectations. What would come next? No one knew for sure, but everyone understood that the power game had already begun. Stalin's funeral was designed to be a spectacle of power and devotion. Moscow was overrun by crowds pressing into the frozen streets to see the leader's coffin, carried amidst applause and tears. For many, the emotion was genuine, the result of decades of propaganda that had turned Stalin into an almost religious symbol. For others, it was just another performance necessary for political survival. Behind the scenes, however, the atmosphere was one of silent rivalry. Beria maintained a dominant presence, controlling access to the body and official communications. Khrushchev and Malenkov, outwardly submissive, discreetly built alliances to contain his rise. Every exchange on the sidelines of the ceremony was an invisible battlefield, where glances and silences carried more weight than speeches. The event that seemed to seal the end of an era actually marked the beginning of another, equally uncertain, but defined by a power game that would determine the Soviet Union's fate for years to come. And, as if history had a cruel sense of irony, the same machine of fear that sustained Stalin for decades would now consume those who sought to succeed him. Subscribe to the channel now to better understand the context of this dark era. And don't leave yet. Click on this video on the screen to learn more about the events that shaped that time.